Opiates, opioids, and the problems they cause are in the headlines daily, but this drug's use actually started thousands of years ago. The latter part of the 20th century was witness to the Vietnam War, the Summer of Love, and finally the D.A.R.E. program. Here to guide us through this critical period is drug historian Dr. David Courtwright. We also have Dr. Bertha Madras, professor of psychobiology and Department of Psychiatry at Harvard, and Dr. Robert Dupont, drug chief to Presidents Nixon and Ford, and founder and president of the Institute for Behavioral Health. And now DrDrew.com presents the history of opium. Part 8, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The second half of the 20th century begins the modern era of addiction treatment, though shock therapy, prefrontal lobotomies, prolonged institutional stays still being used. Other methods were emerging. Dr. David Courtwright.
The most shocking development in drug treatment that emerged in the last half of the 20th century, in my opinion, was actually what happened at Synanon. Synanon was originally a good thing. It was a model for the so-called second-generation therapeutic communities like D.A.R.E or Phoenix House. And then they absolutely went off the rails in the 70s and 80s and became this sort of violent cult that was engaged in illegal activities.
Methadone was becoming a popular form of opiate withdrawal treatment, championed by, again, Dr. Marie Neiswender, and Narcotics Anonymous was finally coming to the fore. The current version of the organization was founded in 1953, based on the traditional 12-step model of recovery. It was established in Southern California by Jimmy Kay after drinking and drug abuse nearly killed him. At the beginning, NA appealed to heroin addicts. The 60s, however, ushered in an era of major social change, inspired by civil rights struggles, Vietnam protest, and more illicit, enlightened so-called drug use. Traditional social mores were challenged regularly. Young people are embracing Timothy Leary's call to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Nixon endeavored to associate marijuana use with hippies and subsequently heroin use with African Americans, this in an effort to control them and levy legal action against both populations. Cannabis came to the United States in the 1920s with Mexican immigrants, but its widespread use didn't occur until the 60s. Initially popular in the jazz community, marijuana use quickly spread to the white youth of America, where its effects, along with other more dangerous drugs, quickly became apparent to a young doctor in Northern California named David Smith. Witnessing the suffering of the burgeoning population of flower children in San Francisco, Smith opened the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic in 1967. He began treating young residents who walked through its doors by the hundreds every day, and whether they arrived ill with pneumonia or in drug withdrawal or addiction, his colleagues provided medical services free of charge, declaring, quote, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. In 2017, the clinic celebrated its 50th anniversary. In 1969, an investigation by Congress determined that 15 to 20% of soldiers in Vietnam had used heroin and that 80% had used marijuana. After visiting troops there, Representative Robert Steele proclaimed that, quote, a soldier going to Vietnam runs a far greater risk of becoming a heroin addict than a combat casualty. It was concluded that heroin use had to do with the fact that it was readily available, cheap, and helped dull the miseries of war. Lots of people were using drugs in Vietnam, which made it, quote, a normal response or a normal way to manage an otherwise unbearable situation. Dr. Bertha Madras?
The vast majority of people who had become addicted to heroin in Vietnam were in procurement. They were in office jobs. They were not on the front lines. Most of the people, the vast majority of soldiers on the front lines didn't touch the stuff because they wanted to survive.
Right.
It was the people who were bored and who had, had a lot of downtime and idle time were the ones who were the heavier users.
While soldiers' drug use in Vietnam had begun to shine a light on heroin abuse, the current American epidemic had actually started around 1965. Initially, minority population living in metropolitan areas on both coasts were affected, and from there it spread to the larger cities all across the country. By 1970, it was in small cities as well. Dr. Robert Dupont.
I just left my training at Harvard Medical School and NIH, and I got my first job after my training, and that was working in the Department of Corrections. And Washington, D.C. then was gripped by a very serious crime wave that had been a major factor in the presidential campaign of 1968. Richard Nixon had called Washington the crime capital of the nation. So there was, and Lyndon Johnson before that had been very focused on the crime in the District of Columbia. So here I was working for the D.C. Department of Corrections and this crime epidemic, and the question was, what's happening? Why is this happening? And what to do about it? And I did a study at the DC jail where I took urine cups and went to everybody who came in for the month of August of 1969. And they found that 44% of them were heroin users. And when I graphed the year that they first used heroin and put that graph up against the crime rate, it tracked completely. That was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was a very big deal in terms of focusing attention on the heroin problem, as it was a major driver of a crime wave that was all over the country, but it was particularly in Washington, D.C. And it was also very important that in those days, Washington, D.C. was a federal city. So the mayor of Washington, Walter Washington, was appointed by the president, Richard Nixon in this case. There was clear responsibility for it from the federal government. That also introduced me to the White House.
One of the major heroin suppliers during this period was an infamous character by the name of Frank Lucas. After a poor upbringing in rural North Carolina, Lucas moved to New York City and immediately embraced a criminal life. When a major Harlem gangster died, he aspired to take over his turf and become a wealthy drug dealer by cutting out the middleman. He achieved this by traveling to Southeast Asia and making connections in the Golden Triangle, where large amounts of heroin were being produced. Having procured the necessary help by paying off officials both overseas and at home, Lucas set about running one of the most profitable drug rings of the day. He was a flamboyant figure. He claimed that drugs were being shipped back to him, to the United States, via specially constructed coffins that had been fitted with false bottoms. The drugs were hidden underneath the bodies of soldiers. Upon his final release from prison, Lucas returned to Harlem with remorse and spoke extensively about the terrible and lasting impact of his criminal activity, particularly as wrought on Harlem. He spent his remaining years trying to repair the damage he had caused. Nixon's so-called war on drugs coincided with the signing of the Controlled Substance Act in 1970. This called for strict regulation of certain drugs and substances. It literally made certain drugs evil. The legislation placed prescription drugs into one of 5 schedules, depending on medical use, abuse potential, and few other factors, mostly social. Schedule 1 drugs are illegal and are deemed to have, quote, no medical use. They included heroin, LSD, marijuana, and cocaine. Doctors couldn't even touch these drugs to get research necessary to see what potential use they might have. Abuse potential was thought to diminish with each successive rung of the so-called scheduling of drugs. This silliness, where certain chemicals, certain molecules are deemed evil, is finally being reversed today. After declaring drug abuse, quote, public enemy number 1, Nixon increased federal funding for drug control agencies and created the Special Action Office for Drug Abuse and Prevention. His next salvo was the formation of the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, formed in 1973 under the leadership of John Bartell. The DEA consolidated many of the agencies that had up until that point been dealing with drug enforcement. 1974 saw the founding of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, a fine research institution that exists and does amazing work to this day, tracing its beginning to a small research unit on the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, formerly the Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. It was established by Congress as the federal focal point for research to increase the knowledge about drug abuse, promote effective strategies to deal with the problem, and develop and manage a nationwide network of drug abuse prevention and training programs. Initially, it focused on heroin and its connection to crime. NIDA supported a great deal of research and would eventually make groundbreaking discoveries on how the brain worked, particularly in the setting of addiction. Its first director was a physician named Robert Dupont, who also served as drug chief under President Nixon and President Ford. Initially, Dupont was a proponent of methadone, which he used to treat many addicts, 90% of whom were minority. He did this in the Washington, D.C. area. Despite his so-called success, a large sector of the public disagreed with this approach because it was increasingly being seen as a way to enslave minority populations. Dr. Robert Dupont.
First of all, heroin addicts today are not predominantly African American, and they were at that point in Washington, D.C., and really all over the country. A very big percentage were. And Richard Nixon was the president. So the charge was that this was a conservative attempt to do harm to the young black men who were the predominant pattern of heroin addiction. So it was a very intense issue there. Now, I want you to remember that the mayor of the city was Walter Washington, who was black and grew up in Washington, D.C. and had the deepest roots you could possibly have in the local community and was loved by everybody in the city. Whenever I would get beaten up over the race issue, I would go to him. He was reassuring me about the black community and pointed out that most of the criticism I was getting was actually from white people, not from black people. And he encouraged me one time, he said to me, if I don't see you for a couple of weeks, I think you're either sick or move on to another job, and I don't want either of those things to happen.
Nixon's presidency was associated with methadone expansion, which only increased the public's opinion that the administration was trying to keep African Americans and others from being politically active. Eventually, Dupont would come to the conclusion that these circumstances were untenable as they related to using methadone, because it was also addictive, and treating one addictive drug with another was just, quote, never going to work. Another example of the medical community failing to recognize the history, the repeats, doing it again. Notably, Dupont was one of the authors of, quote, the White Paper on Drug Abuse in 1975. This was written for President Gerald Ford. The document intended to assess the extent of drug abuse in America and make recommendations on how the federal government might reduce it. Reflecting back on the paper in 2000, Dupont was embarrassed about the unsophisticated analysis contained in the paper. He takes responsibility for his part and believes that it, quote, failed to understand the nature of addiction. Dr. Robert Dupont.
The message of the white paper was we've forgotten about other drugs of abuse. At the time, this particularly had to do with barbiturates and stimulants and benzodiazepines. And methadone was not a treatment for any of those. So the message there of the white paper, which was a good message, was we got to broaden our focus in understanding the drug problem and in drug treatment. And that's what happened.
In 1983, the Los Angeles Police Department created D.A.R.E, Drug Abuse Resistance Education, a program that sent police officers into schools to educate and warn children about the dangers of drug use. Despite having been implemented in over 75% of schools, a 2009 study showed that the program was largely ineffective. Teens that were enrolled in the program were just as likely to use drugs as those who were not. Dr. David Courtwright.
The D.A.R.E program cannot really be judged a success. There were some aspects of it that seemed to work for a time. And an example of that would be the steady decline in high school marijuana smoking during the 1980s. So youthful marijuana smoking was at an all-time high in the late 1970s, but then it started to come down significantly during the 1980s and right on up till about 1992. On the other hand, if you take a sort of broader look at the problem, you ask the question, well, has drug education generally discouraged young people from using drugs? The answer is clearly no. We've got everything from vaping to pain pills. They're still a big problem. So it's certainly not been a panacea.
To that end, D.A.R.E has made many adjustments to their curriculum and as of 2018 have added lessons about the current opioid epidemic. In 1993, the DSM-3R, this is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that physicians use to make diagnoses, provides the standard criteria for classification and distinguishes 3 levels of drug-related behaviors and functioning. They were drug dependence, drug abuse, and drug use. It was suggested that these be regarded as concentric circles that would ebb and flow as people move back and forth between the groups. That same year, the U.S. National Research Council and Committee on Substance Abuse Prevention Research declared in summary, quote, heroin use is so rare as to be barely measurable. Thank you to all of our experts who weighed in this critical period in the history of opium and opiates. I want to thank our staff at Doctor.com, particularly Michelle Poe, for pulling this opium series together. Read the entire series and our weekly medical articles as well, all at drdrew.com. Be sure to join our email list. You'll get it automatically, and please do tell a friend. Well, CBDs are everywhere, right? Everyone's talking about them, and it's a topic that I get asked about all the time. Bottom line on CBD, although there are way more claims made about them, the clinical evidence right now, it's not all that clear, but many people are using it and reporting great results, and they are very encouraging. So I want to first define exactly what I'm talking about here. CBD is cannabidiol, an extract from hemp. While you might associate with marijuana, CBD does not cause reinforcement. It is not the reinforcing component of hemp, but it is what's responsible for the calming or some of the relaxing effects that many people experience, not the high. Now about the products. There are a ton of them on the market today. For getting the vast array of the reported health benefits, it's important to be aware of what you're buying. I was recently introduced to a company called Select CBD, an Oregon-based company that focuses on high-quality ingredients and manufacturing standards, not the hype. Their CBD-based products are available in a wide range of formulations and flavors, each of which is described to you so you can make an informed decision without all those promises that are probably too good to be true. Like I said, the reported benefits of CBD by individuals using this are very compelling. I'm excited to see how things develop as the science catches up with this booming industry. As usual, the public is ahead of the science. I can't make explicit claims yet, but boy, the reports are pretty encouraging. So if you're ready to try CBD, I encourage you to check out Select CBD. To learn more, go to drdrew.com/select. That's on my site, drdrew.com/SELECT. And for a limited time, you can save 25% at checkout with the code DRDREW, DRDREW. Again, drdrew.com/select, and then the code DRDREW.